On the 11th of April, 1892, the men of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, who ruled Wyoming Territory as their own private government, lay behind the log walls of the TA Ranch, their own horses shot dead in the yard. Closing in were nearly 400 armed men, the very people this expedition had ridden north to kill. Days earlier they had come with dynamite, a surgeon, a newspaper man to write their account, and a list of some 70 names for killing. Each hired gun paid $5 a day and $50 more for every name he crossed off. Now they watched a rolling engine of logs, built by their intended victims, creep toward them, carrying dynamite enough to finish what they had ridden north to do. How the richest men in the territory came to beg the President of the United States to save them from the people they had come to kill turns on whether the cavalry would reach them in time, on who had written the list and why, on what became of the man whose diary would outlive him, and on whether any of the 50 invaders would ever answer for it. Chapter 1. The Club That Owned Wyoming. The men crouched behind their own dead horses had not needed to fight for anything in years. For most of 2 decades they had simply ruled, and the instrument of that rule carried a name almost comically dull for what it would become: the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. On paper, it began as nothing more than an inspection bureau. Cattle wandered across an open, fenceless range. Brands got copied, blurred, or claimed by more than one owner at once. So the territory's ranchers organized, the way stockmen organized across the West, to keep an honest brand book, to police their own roundups, and to inspect the herds moving toward the railheads, so that one man's calf did not end up shipped under another man's name. Nothing in those early meetings suggested an organization that would one day carry a list of 70 men marked for killing. It looked, if anything, like tidiness, like paperwork. But an association that controls the brand book controls who is legally permitted to own a cow. And in Wyoming Territory, the association came to control nearly everything a cow touched, and a great deal that had nothing to do with cattle at all. Its members sat in the territorial legislature in numbers large enough to write the laws they would later be the ones to enforce. It set the calendar and the boundaries of every roundup held in Wyoming, which meant a rancher left off the official roster could not legally gather even his own herd outside the district and the season the association assigned him. Its inspectors stood at the stockyards and the shipping pens, and, in practice, not the territory's courts, decided whose brand on whose animal would be honored and whose would not. And when the governor's chair came open, the man who filled it was, more often than not, a member of the association himself, or a man the association had put there. There was a newspaper in Cheyenne that could be relied upon to print the association's version of a dispute before the small ranchers ever heard there had been one. There was a legislature that could be relied upon to pass what the association's committee had already drafted. There was a governor's office that could be relied upon not to ask questions the association had not already answered. None of it required force. None of it needed to. A private club of cattlemen had built, quietly and legally, the government of an entire American territory, and had done it through brand books and inspection fees and roundup schedules, the most boring instruments imaginable. 2 versions of what came later exist, and this is where the choice between them gets made. In one, this was frontier chaos, a range war that simply got out of hand between neighbors who had run out of patience with each other. In the other, 40 men who already controlled the roundups, the brand book, the legislature, and the governor's chair decided which of their neighbors deserved to go on living, and used the very machinery built to inspect cattle to decide it. The men behind the log walls at the TA Ranch had not stumbled into the position of judge over Johnson County. They had been sitting in that chair comfortably for years. It is worth pausing on how ordinary the founding purpose actually was. Nobody in that early room, arguing over how to keep brand records straight, was plotting an invasion. The association was not born as a killing apparatus. It was born as the kind of bureaucratic housekeeping that every growing industry produces, the sort of institution a reference book would describe in a single flat sentence and move on from. That is precisely the danger in it. The authority to say which brand was legitimate and which roundup was official never looked like a weapon while it was being assembled. It became one only later, when the association needed a legal reason to call its poorer neighbors thieves. For now, in the years before the reckoning, the association was simply rich, and getting richer on an open range that seemed built to make rich men richer forever. Fortunes were being made in Wyoming grass at a pace that would have astonished the men who first wrote out the brand book. That fortune was the reason the association could buy a legislature and a governor's chair in the first place. It was also, though none of them could see it yet, the reason the whole structure was about to come apart. The range that had made them was about to turn on them first, long before their neighbors ever did. The paperwork was not finished with them yet. Chapter 2. The Bonanza That Froze to Death. The fortune that had just bought Wyoming's legislature and its governor's chair rested on a clock none of the men behind it had heard start ticking. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the open range running north from Cheyenne into the Powder River country looked less like a landscape than a machine for turning grass into money. A man could run cattle on public land he did not own, did not fence, and barely had to feed, and sell the calves at railhead prices that made the arithmetic almost embarrassing. Word of that arithmetic crossed an ocean. English lords and the younger sons of British peerage, men who had never smelled a branding fire, wired money into Wyoming cattle companies from drawing rooms in London and Edinburgh, alongside Eastern bankers who had never ridden further west than Omaha. They did not come to see the grass. They came to see the return on it, and for a decade the return obliged them. The men of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association rode that decade the hardest. Herds that had been modest in the early roundups multiplied year over year on grass nobody had to plant, and the association's members went from prosperous stockmen to the kind of wealth that bought legislative seats they already controlled through easier means. It was not obvious to any of them that the range had a ceiling. Every spring the calf crop grew, and every year new capital arrived from the east and from across the Atlantic, asking for more of the same. Nobody in Cheyenne was counting the blades of grass against the number of mouths now grazing them. The roundup crews still rode the same trails, the chuck wagons still fed the same cowhands their bacon and beans under the same wide sky, and the open range still looked, from a rich man's window, like a resource that could not run out. It was already running out. Then came the winter the men who survived it would call the Great Die-Up. The winter of 1886 and 87 arrived on the northern plains without the mercy of an early warning. Blizzard followed blizzard through a season that never properly broke, burying the grass the overcrowded herds needed to reach, and locking the rivers the cattle needed to drink from under ice a man could walk across. Cattle that had spent a decade fattening on free grass now stood in snow up to their briskets with nothing beneath it to eat, and froze on their feet in the coulees and along the riverbanks where they had drifted, looking for a windbreak that open range had never provided. When the thaw finally came, the cattlemen who rode out to count what was left found carcasses instead of a count, whole seasons of investment lying dead in the draws from the Wyoming line north into Montana. The English money noticed first. Shareholders who had never seen Wyoming grass began asking, by cable, exactly how a business that had promised such certain return had produced instead such catastrophic loss, and the answers Cheyenne sent back were not answers a London drawing room found comforting. Companies folded. Absentee capital that had poured in on the promise of an inexhaustible range pulled back overnight, and the men who had grown rich enough to own a territory's legislature discovered that the same unfenced range that had made them was equally capable of unmaking them in a single season without asking their permission first. What survived the winter was not the same as what had gone into it. The association that emerged from the great die-up still controlled the brand book and the roundups, still held its seats in the legislature and its claim on the governor's chair, and its members still counted among the richest men in the territory. But they counted their herds differently now. A decade of easy grass had taught them that fortunes could be made without much watching. One winter had taught them the opposite lesson, that every animal left on that range mattered, and that every calf gone uncounted was money the weather might already be planning to take. The men who had once let a stray calf wander unbranded without a second thought were about to decide that no calf anywhere in Wyoming would be allowed to wander unclaimed again. That decision would not stay a private grievance for long. It was about to become a law. Chapter 3. The Law That Turned Neighbors into Thieves. An unbranded calf, orphaned before the roundup and too young to carry anyone's iron, was the smallest thing a man could own on the open range. It was also where the Johnson County War began, years before anyone fired a shot. Before the chartered train, before the list of 70 names, the association wrote a law that did something quieter than any of that, and, in the long run, more dangerous. It did not aim a gun at anyone. It changed who was legally allowed to claim an animal born on open ground, and in doing so, it changed what an ordinary rancher's ordinary autumn could cost him. On the open range, a calf that lost its mother before branding wandered off ahead of the roundup crews, or was simply born too late in the season to carry a mark, had a name among the men who worked cattle. They called it a maverick. For as long as the open range had existed, a maverick belonged, by a custom older than any statute in Cheyenne, to whoever roped it first and burned an iron into its hide. It was the one mechanism by which a cowhand with a decent horse, a steady branding fire, and no capital behind him could start a herd of his own out of nothing but a rope and the accidents of a hard season. The wealthiest members of the association had used that same custom themselves in leaner years before the beef bonanza to build the very herds that now grazed under their own brands from the North Platte into the Powder River country. In 1884, with the losses of the great die-up still being tallied in the roundup ledgers, the association's members sat in the territorial legislature they already controlled and wrote that custom almost entirely out of a small rancher's reach. Under the new law, an unbranded calf found at roundup no longer belonged to the man who claimed it there. It belonged, by statute, to the association itself, to be sold at auction to the highest bidder among its own membership, the proceeds banked to pay for the very brand inspectors and roundup apparatus that had just made the old custom illegal. Those inspectors answered to the association and to no one else in the territory, and it was now their word, not a rancher's rope, that decided whose iron counted at roundup and whose did not. For a cattleman running 10,000 head across a dozen roundup districts, the loss of a season's mavericks was a bookkeeping entry absorbed without a second thought. For a homesteader running 40 cows on a single quarter section along the Powder River or the Sweetwater, a maverick or two at roundup had been the one honest way to close the gap between his outfit and the men who already owned the legislature, the brand book, and the governor's chair. The new law did not merely take that maverick away. It took the word for what he had always done, the same thing half the great outfits had once done to get their own start, and handed the association the sole authority to define it. A calf claimed the old way, the customary way, was no longer custom. It was theft. And the man who had done it, whether he had done it once or never at all, was no longer a neighbor working the same hard range as everyone else. He was a rustler. It was a label with no fixed boundary. It did not require a court, a jury, or even a missing animal. Only the suspicion of a stock detective or the say-so of a brand inspector drawing his wages from the association he served. A small rancher who competed too well, who spoke against the big outfits at a stockman's meeting, or who simply owned land the association wanted grazed by someone else's cattle, could be called a rustler as easily as a man caught red-handed with a running iron. The word did the work no courtroom would. It turned an economic rival into a criminal before a single fact was ever tested. That word needed only an example to prove how far it could reach, and how easily, once fixed to a person rather than a practice, it could be made to justify almost anything done to remove him. Wyoming would supply that example within a few years of the law's passage, and the first name attached to it would not belong to a hardened outlaw at all. Chapter 4. A Hanging Nobody Paid For. It belonged to Ella Watson and to a homesteader named Jim Averell, and neither of them would live to see how far that word could reach. In the summer of 1889, 3 years before the chartered train and the list of 70 names, a group of the valley's larger stockmen rode onto the claim the two of them worked side by side, accused them both of running off association cattle, and hanged them from the same tree before nightfall. No sheriff made an arrest that day. No judge heard a case. No jury was ever asked to weigh a single fact, because no trial was ever held for anyone to attend. The charge itself came straight out of the ledger the maverick law had rewritten 5 years earlier. Watson and Averell were building a small herd, the old honest way, out of the stray and unbranded stock that roundup custom had always allowed a homesteader to claim, the very method the biggest outfits in the territory had used to found their own fortunes a decade before. Whether either of them had taken a single head of stock that was not rightfully theirs is a question no court in Wyoming Territory was ever asked to answer. The men who rode onto that claim did not need a conviction before they acted. They needed only the word, and thanks to 1884, the word was already loaded against anyone smaller than the association's own membership. Watson did not enter the historical record as a homesteader hanged on an unproven charge. She entered it as Cattle Kate, a name attached to her after her death by newspapers that took their account of the killing from the same stockmen who had supplied the rope. It was a name built for the story the association needed remembered, not 2 neighbors murdered without a trial, but a rustler queen and her partner in crime dealt with the way rustlers were said to deserve. More than 100 years of retelling has never settled how much of that story was fact and how much was manufactured by the men who stood to gain from a lynching being remembered as frontier justice instead of murder. What survives every version, favorable or hostile, is the plainer and worse fact underneath it. A woman and a man were hanged above the range they were homesteading in 1889 on a charge that never once had to survive a courtroom, brought by men who were also its judges. Word of the hanging traveled across the territory the way word of any killing does. It reached Cheyenne within days and the newspapers within a week, and it reached every small rancher within 100 miles long before that, carried hand to hand at line camps and roundup fires. If the killing was read anywhere as a warning of what an association of cattlemen could do to a neighbor, it decided to call a thief. Nothing in the 3 years that followed showed it. No one connected to the deaths on that claim was ever indicted. No one stood trial. Every man believed to have ridden out to the hanging tree that day returned to his own herd, his own roundup district, and his own seat in good standing among the association's membership, and none of them lost it. For the small ranchers scattered along the same range Watson and Averell had worked, the silence that followed was its own kind of message. No warrant had come for them either, but none was needed to make the point. A neighbor could be named a rustler, hanged for it, and the men who did the hanging could return to their ledgers and their roundup crews without so much as a summons. Fear does not wait on a verdict to take hold. It needs only an example, left standing, unanswered long enough that everyone understands the answer will not come. That silence was the entire lesson, and it was learned by exactly the men who would need it most. By the spring of 1892, the association did not have to guess whether hanging a rustler would cost its members anything. It already had the proof, 3 years old and never once tested in a courtroom, that in Wyoming Territory an accusation was sufficient and a rope was final, and that the men who carried it out could go home to supper afterward. What had been done to 2 homesteaders on a single afternoon in 1889 on the strength of an accusation alone, the association was already learning to imagine doing to 70. And nobody paid. Chapter 5. A Murder Planned Like a Payroll. Johnson County thought the Maverick law had settled the matter. It had not. What the association had learned from a rope thrown over a cottonwood tree in 1889 was not that the matter was closed, but that it could be reopened at any scale its members chose, and that the choosing carried no cost. In the months before a chartered train ever left Cheyenne, that lesson stopped being a memory the cattlemen carried privately and became a plan they carried on paper, assembled inside the association's own offices by its own executive committee, in the same rooms where roundup districts were assigned and brand books were kept. Nothing about the killing to come was left to a mob's temper. It was left to men who kept ledgers for a living and saw no reason an expedition should be organized any differently than a roundup. The men in that room had every reason to feel their time was short. The range that had made their fortunes had already frozen once, in the winter that killed half their herds, and the law they had written to protect what was left had done nothing but multiply the neighbors it turned into enemies. A committee that feels its wealth slipping and its enemies multiplying does not, as a rule, choose patience. It chooses procedure, and calls the procedure a solution. Command of it went to Major Frank Wolcott, a stockman of the association's own rank, who carried a military title and meant to use it. Wolcott ran the operation the way a field officer runs a campaign, not the way a posse forms on a courthouse step. There would be a chain of command, a manifest, a schedule. There would be no ambiguity about who gave the order and who followed it, because an order given by nobody in particular is an order nobody can later be hanged for, and the men drawing up this one intended to hang for nothing. The list itself was placed in the hands of Frank Canton, and the choice was its own quiet joke on the county about to receive him. Canton had once worn the badge of sheriff in Johnson County, the elected keeper of its peace, before he left the office to work as a stock detective for the very association now sending him back. The county that had once trusted him to arrest its criminals was about to meet him leading the men sent to kill its citizens, and the difference between the 2 roles, in Canton's own hands, had turned out to be a matter of who was paying him. The men who would do the actual killing were not drawn from Wyoming at all. The association reached south into Texas and recruited roughly 23 gunmen there, men with no stake in the range they were about to invade and no neighbors among the names they would be asked to shoot. They were not asked to volunteer for a cause. They were hired for a wage, $5 for every day they carried a rifle in Wyoming, and a bonus of $50 laid on top of that wage for every man on the list they killed. The contract did not speak of rustlers or justice or the range. It spoke of day rates and bounties, the plain vocabulary of a payroll, applied to human lives the way it might have been applied to wolf pelts or fence posts. Wyoming had cowhands enough of its own who could have ridden the same range for the same money, but a neighbor sent to shoot a neighbor is a neighbor who might hesitate at the door, and hesitation was the one expense the committee could not afford to budget for. A hired Texan owed the men on that list nothing, had never worked a roundup beside them, and would collect his $50 whether the man at the end of his rifle was a stranger or not. The distance between the shooter and his target was the whole reason the shooters came from Texas. Set side by side, the arithmetic of the thing has its own accounting, an executive committee to authorize it, a major to command it, a former sheriff to guide it to its targets, and 23 hired men paid by the day and by the kill. Nothing about that arrangement resembled a range war breaking out between angry neighbors. It looked instead like a business expense, budgeted, staffed, and priced per head, and priced cheaply at that. The association had spent decades pricing cattle to the dollar. It now priced a killing the same way, and did so without a single member of the executive committee apparently pausing to notice how the exercise looked written down. What Wolcott and Canton and the Texas gunmen were being assembled to deliver was still, at this stage, an operation without a target list anyone outside the association's own rooms had seen. The names had not yet been read aloud. The paper that would decide who lived through the coming spring and who did not was still being drawn up in Cheyenne, folded, and carried toward a train that had not yet left the yard. The operation had its price well before it had its names. Chapter 6. 70 names and one purpose. The price was set before the names were, and while the county still trusted in the maverick law, a second document was already circulating that made no pretense of law at all. It carried no statute number and cited no court. It was a list kept in Canton's own hand, and it did what a law never could. It named the men, roughly 70 of them, not 70 head of stock, not 70 claims disputed at a land office window, but 70 human beings, set down by name, marked for a single outcome. The list made no distinction between a man who had branded one unclaimed calf and a man who had branded none. It made no distinction between a hired hand and an elected officer of the county. Johnson County's own sheriff was on it, the man the county's voters had put behind the badge. So were men who sat on its board, who kept its records, who ran the offices a county needs simply to function. The plan assembled in Cheyenne had never been only about punishing rustling. It was to remove Johnson County's leadership entire, the elected alongside the accused, and leave no one behind who could still make the county's case. A county whose sheriff and whose commissioners are dead does not investigate the men who killed them. It buries them and asks no further questions, and that silence was the second purpose the list was built to serve. 2 names on that list belonged to men who had never held office and never would. One was Nathan Champion, a small rancher known on the range as Nate. The other was Reuben Ray, called Nick by everyone who knew him. Neither man had written a law, sat on a commission, or given an order to anyone. Both were entered on the same page as the sheriffs and the commissioners, as though the distance between an elected officer and a working rancher meant nothing once a name was set down on paper. On a list built to erase a county's government, the presence of 2 ordinary ranchers said plainly what the list was actually for, It was not aimed at office alone. It was aimed at anyone the association had decided to be finished with. The arithmetic did not soften it. 70 names, drawn up by one man, for delivery by 52 more already gathering in Cheyenne. No warrant accompanied the list. No court had reviewed a single name on it, and none in Wyoming would be asked to. It was a private paper, written by men who had just finished pricing a killing like a payroll, and it went a step further than any payroll required. A ledger tracks who is owed money. This one tracked who was owed a bullet, and it did so in the same flat clerical hand that had once tracked branded calves, applied now to sheriffs, clerks, and small ranchers alike. It had no separate column for a man's office, and none for his innocence. The list did not stay folded in a drawer. Within days it went into a satchel bound for a rail yard, alongside dynamite, alongside surgical supplies, alongside the 52 men who had signed on to use it. None of the 70 names on it had been read aloud in a courtroom, or read aloud anywhere at all, outside the rooms where the association did its business. The men whose names were on that paper were, on the morning it was folded shut, still tending their own stock, still sitting in their own offices, entirely unaware that a county's worth of killing had already been budgeted, staffed, and addressed to them personally. Whatever Johnson County still believed about the reach of the Maverick law, the men in Cheyenne had already moved past argument and into logistics. The train had not left yet, but it was already being loaded. Chapter 7. 50 Guns on a Chartered Train. On the night of April the 5th, 1992, the loading finally became a departure. At the rail yard in Cheyenne, a private train stood chartered and waiting, its cars given over entirely to the men the association had assembled, and everything those men would need once they reached the ground where the killing was meant to happen. Nothing about the boarding was hurried or furtive. The men who owned Wyoming's legislature and its governor's chair did not need to hide a train they had paid for outright, and so the loading went on in plain view of whoever in Cheyenne cared to watch it, an army assembling itself with the same unbothered confidence it had used to write a death list in the first place. Roughly 50 of them climbed aboard, the cattlemen and foremen of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, alongside the 24 or so hired Texas gunmen, Major Frank Wolcott installed as field commander, Frank Canton somewhere among them with the list still in his keeping. Horses went into the stock cars, wagons went in behind the horses, and behind the wagons went the dynamite, packed for a campaign its planners expected to end in demolition as readily as in gunfire. The ammunition alone told its own story. A witness who saw what went aboard that night would later describe a supply so large it amounted, in his words, to enough to kill all the people in the state of Wyoming. That was not the language of men riding out to serve a warrant. It was the language of men equipping themselves for a siege they expected to win, against an enemy they expected to outnumber and overwhelm long before anyone outside Johnson County even learned they had left Cheyenne. Wolcott's expedition took care of that detail too. Behind them, as the train pulled north, the telegraph lines went dead, cut so that no word of what was coming could outrun the men bringing it. A county the size of Johnson had no way to defend itself against a danger it had not been told existed, and the men on that train intended to keep it that way for as long as the tracks and the wires allowed. The version of events the country would eventually read had already been decided before the train cleared the yard. A newspaper correspondent had been brought along for exactly that purpose, seated among the gunmen and the cattlemen, as though his presence were simply one more line item the expedition's planners had thought to budget, the same way they had budgeted a doctor. A surgeon rode with them as well, packed and provisioned for the wounds the barons fully expected their own side to take. Between the two of them, the reporter and the physician, the expedition had made arrangements for both the story it wanted told and the injuries it wanted treated, as if nothing about the days ahead could possibly go in a direction its organizers had failed to plan for. The account that correspondent had been hired to carry back to Cheyenne was meant to be the only account anyone would ever need. It would not turn out that way, though on the night the train left the yard, not one man aboard it had reason to imagine otherwise. What the 50 of them carried north, beyond the horses and the wagons and the case upon case of ammunition, was a destination and a purpose that had not changed since the list was folded into Canton's satchel. The train was bound for Buffalo, the seat of Johnson County, the town where the men on that list kept their offices, ran their ranches, and slept on the night of April the 5th, entirely unaware that a chartered train was already carrying 50 armed men and a surgeon's kit toward them. The wires that might have warned them hung cut and silent somewhere behind the tracks. For now, the only sound was the train itself, moving north through the dark with its cargo of dynamite, its hired guns, and its own appointed witness, carrying a story north before a single one of the 70 names on that list had any idea it was coming. Chapter 8. One Man Against 50 Guns. Everything the expedition had assembled to overwhelm an entire county, the 50 riders, the dynamite, the supplies bought by a cut telegraph line, was about to be spent for the better part of a day on one ranch house and the man inside it. Before the invaders ever reached Buffalo, before a single name on Frank Canton's list even learned a private train had left Cheyenne, the column stopped short at a modest cattle camp called the K.C. Ranch. Among the men still asleep inside its main cabin that morning was Nate Champion, a Johnson County foreman whose name sat near the top of the list in Canton's keeping, and beside him was Nick Ray. Finding Champion there by chance, ahead of schedule and unguarded, Wolcott's men judged him worth killing on the spot rather than waiting for Buffalo. 2 trappers who had the misfortune of being at the ranch that same morning were seized before they understood what they had walked into and held under guard outside, witnesses to a fight they had no part in starting. Nick Ray was cut down within the first exchange of gunfire shot in the yard before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and carried no further part in what followed. The invaders had planned for exactly this, a quick, quiet killing, finished before breakfast, the column back on the road to Buffalo by mid-morning with 2 more names crossed off a list of 70. That was the plan. It lasted about as long as it took Champion to reach a rifle and a window. What Wolcott's 50 men had not planned for was a single defender who did not run, did not surrender, and did not miss. Champion held the cabin through the morning and then through the afternoon, firing from whichever window gave him a line on the nearest rifle flash, forcing 50 armed men to answer one. Riders who came within range went back with wounds or without their nerve, and the ranch buildings meant to shelter 2 men for a night became, for one man, a fortress he had never asked for and now could not safely leave. Hours the expedition had budgeted for a 5-minute killing turned into most of a day spent circling a single small building on an open stretch of Wyoming grass, in plain sight of a wagon road that led eventually to a county that still did not know they were coming. 50 rifles against 1 defender, a full day's light burned against a killing meant to take an hour, the whole of an army's advantage narrowed down to whether a single man's ammunition would run out before his nerve did. The men who had bought a private train, a surgeon, and a correspondent to record their triumph found themselves instead recording a delay, one they had no way to explain away as anything but a single rancher outlasting an army sent to erase him. Champion was not a trained soldier, and had never commanded so much as a posse, but he had spent his working life reading a landscape for exactly the kind of threat now surrounding him, and that reading was the only advantage the day gave him. He rationed his shots. He moved between the cabin's windows rather than holding one position long enough to be found by return fire. He watched the tree line and the low ground where a rush might come from, and every time the gunmen outside tested his attention, they drew fire accurate enough to make the next test slower and more careful than the last. None of it changed the arithmetic waiting for him once the light failed, and the invaders stopped relying on rifles alone. The newspaper correspondent brought along to write the expedition's version of events had a clear vantage on all of it. The horses held back out of range, the riders rotating in and out of cover, the long stalled hours accumulating around a single ranch house that refused to fall. Nothing in his instructions had prepared him to record an army pinned in place by one rifle. Whatever account he was still expected to carry back to Cheyenne, the morning's tidy plan, a killing finished before breakfast, was no longer the story unfolding in front of him. In the lulls between exchanges of fire, in whatever quiet the shooting allowed him, Champion had begun to write. A small notebook, a stub of pencil, entries set down as the day around him happened rather than remembered afterward, an account being kept in real time by the one man on that ranch with no illusions left about how the day was likely to end. What he wrote in those pages that afternoon would outlast every one of the 50 men trying to kill him, though nothing in the smoke and rifle fire around the KC ranch gave any sign of that yet. By the time the light began to slant low and gold across the grass, the men surrounding the cabin had stopped waiting for Champion to run out of daylight and started looking instead for a way to burn him out of it. Chapter 9. The diary written inside a burning house. Fire was the one weapon 50 rifles had not managed to answer with all day, and by late afternoon it was the only option left. Piling fuel against the cabin walls, where Champion could not reach them without stepping into open fire, the invaders set the house alight, and the plan that had failed since sunrise, waiting him out with bullets, gave way to a plan meant to finish him with smoke and heat instead. Inside, with the light going and the walls starting to burn around him, Nate Champion kept doing the one thing that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being believed afterward. He kept writing. The notebook survived the day its author did not, and what is written in it reads less like a man composing his own eulogy than like a man taking notes in the middle of a shift that would not end. Earlier, with the gunfire still general and Nick Ray already down in the yard, Champion had set the fact down plainly, without ornament, the way a foreman logs anything else that needs recording. "Nick is dead," he wrote. "He died about 9 o'clock. There is no grief performed on the page, no address to anyone in particular, just a dead man's name and a time, entered because it was true and because someone, someday, might need to know it. Hours later, alone with the shooting still coming from every direction and no one left inside the cabin to trade a word with, he wrote something closer to what the day actually felt like from inside it. "Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now," he wrote. "I wish there was someone here with me so we could watch all sides at once. It is not a brave line, and it was never meant to be read as one. It is a working man noting, for whoever came looking later, that the worst part of the day was not the bullets. It was being the only person left to watch for them. By the time smoke was working its way through the cabin and the walls themselves were catching, the entries had stopped describing the siege and started describing its ending. "Well, they have just got through shelling the house like hail," he wrote, and then, in the same short passage, the line that would outlive every man who had ridden north to kill him. "The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." He kept the notebook on him as he wrote it, which is the only reason anyone would ever read it. What happened next took minutes. Driven out of a cabin that was no longer a shelter, but a furnace, Champion ran for whatever cover the open ground offered, and the 50 men positioned around the KC ranch, who had spent an entire day failing to hit a target behind log walls, did not fail against one running across open grass. He went down within yards of the burning building he had held since morning, and the men who reached his body afterward did not stop at killing him. Exactly how many times he was hit is a question the record never settled. Some later tallies counted his wounds near 30. Other accounts, drawn from reporting closer to the day itself, put the number nearer 10. What every account agrees on is the excess. A single man, already dead or dying, shot again and again by riders who had needed an entire day to accomplish what one clean shot could have done in the first hour. Then, as if the killing itself needed a caption, someone pinned a card to what was left of him. It read, "Cattle thieves beware." It was meant as a warning to the other 69 names still on Frank Canton's list, a message written for a county that had not yet learned the invaders were coming. Instead, it became the first piece of evidence that the expedition had planned to leave behind. The barons had brought their own newspaper man for exactly this purpose, to shape how the day would be remembered, and it was that same correspondent, traveling with the men who had just killed Champion, who was handed the small notebook found on his body. He carried it out of the Powder River country along with the rest of the expedition's baggage, and in time its contents went to print, not as the baron's account of a rustler's death, but as Nate Champion's own account of his final hours, in his own hand, entered while it was happening. A man they had marked for silencing had written the one record of that day no one riding with Wolcott could revise, and the reporter brought along to protect the invaders' story ended up delivering the words that would undo it. None of that was visible yet from the yard of the KC ranch. To the 50 men remounting as the light failed, the day looked finished. One name and then 2 crossed off a list of 70. A delay longer than planned, but a job done all the same, with Buffalo and the rest of Canton's names still ahead of them, and no one left alive at this ranch to carry word of what had happened here. The barons rode away, believing the matter was closed. They had no way of knowing that the notebook now riding north with their own correspondent would reach print, or that word of what had happened at the KC ranch was already further ahead of them than they knew. Chapter 10. The Hunters Become the Hunted. Since riding out of Cheyenne, the expedition had moved exactly as it pleased. A chartered train no one had stopped. A telegraph line no one had used. A ranch held for a full day against 50 rifles and lost anyway. That run of total control was about to end, and it ended because of a man Frank Canton's list had never bothered to name. On the road north toward Buffalo, a Johnson County rancher named Jack Flagg came within sight of the men who had just killed Nate Champion and Nick Ray. He did not wait to learn whether his own name belonged on that list. He turned and rode and outran 50 armed men across open Wyoming ground with nothing behind him but 2 days of gunfire and a burning cabin. He reached Buffalo, still moving, carrying the one piece of information the invaders believed only they possessed, their own position. Little of this history survives in the form audiences actually know it. The version that reached theaters came from Cheyenne and from Heaven's Gate, not from a county courthouse record or a telegraph line cut behind a chartered train. Viewers who want the documented conspiracy underneath that myth, the paper trail the films left out, are the reason this channel keeps digging past the folklore rather than repeating it. Subscribing keeps that kind of history arriving in your feed instead of staying buried in an archive. While the barons pushed north, still believing Johnson County had no notion of what was riding toward it, farther up the trail in Buffalo, Sheriff W.G. Angus, known to the county as Red, already had the news flag had carried in. Angus commanded no soldiers, he commanded a county, and he called on it exactly as he found it. Shopkeepers who had never drawn a weapon in anger, homesteaders whose unbranded calves the maverick law had already marked as theft, cowhands, clerks, and the small ranchers Frank Canton's list had named as rustlers, answering a summons raised on their behalf rather than against them. What began as a handful of armed men riding out of Buffalo grew within a day into a citizens' force, numbering in the hundreds, swelling toward 300 or 400 strong, a county turning out under arms in numbers neither side had thought Johnson County capable of producing. For years the association had governed this county from a boardroom in Cheyenne, deciding by brand book and roundup district who counted as a rancher and who counted as a thief. Buffalo had just answered that question for itself. Word of that force outran its riders. 50 men and a wagon load of dynamite had been assembled to overrun isolated ranch houses one at a time, not to meet an armed county in open country, and faced with a force it could not hope to fight in the field. Wolcott's expedition abandoned the push on Buffalo entirely. It turned instead for the nearest ground that could be fortified, the log buildings of the T.A. Ranch, short of the town it had meant to take by surprise. The invaders reached it still armed, still supplied, still confident enough to believe a ranch house would hold until word could reach Cheyenne and Cheyenne could send help of its own. What they could not yet see was how completely the expedition had reversed itself. 6 days earlier, 50 men had boarded a private train to hunt a list of 70 names through a county with no way to fight back. Now, those same 50 men were barricading themselves behind their own dead horses, counting cartridges and waiting on rescue from the very county they had ridden north to destroy. The hunters had run out of road. The hunted had found their feet. Chapter 11. The log machine rolling toward them. There is a reason this story is still told in Wyoming more than a century later, and it is not the killing at the KC Ranch. It is the image the story keeps returning to, the richest men in the territory, the men who had boarded a chartered train 9 days earlier with a list long enough to name 70 of their neighbors and money enough to hire 50 guns to cross those names off, now flat on their stomachs behind the bodies of their own horses, watching the county they had come to conquer build a machine to finish them. By the morning of April the 11th, Sheriff Angus's citizens had closed the ring completely. The force that had ridden out of Buffalo as a few dozen men had grown overnight into something closer to a small army of its own, 300 strong by the more careful counts, nearer 400 by the time every rancher and shopkeeper within reach of the news had saddled a horse and turned south. They surrounded the log buildings of the T.A. Ranch on every side. The invaders had not already barricaded with their own dead stock, and for the better part of a day they simply waited, certain that numbers alone would end it. Numbers alone did not end it. Rifle fire, traded back and forth for 2 full days, accomplished what rifle fire against log walls generally accomplishes, which is very little. The invaders had food, water, and most of the ammunition they had loaded onto the train days earlier, a supply one witness had already described as enough to kill everyone in the state of Wyoming, along with a barricade the horses had provided them without being asked. 50 armed men behind a fortified ranch house could not be dug out by rifles alone, and both sides knew it within hours of the first shots. The posse settled into positions around the ranch and kept them, trading fire through the daylight and holding their ground through nights that offered the barons no chance to slip away and no army yet in sight to relieve them. So Johnson County built something that could do what rifles could not. The accounts that survive give it 2 names, the go-devil in some, the ark of safety in others, and it was exactly what both names promised. Citizens who had never fired a shot at another man 3 days earlier stripped logs from the ranch's own timber and bolted them into a rolling breastwork, mounted on the running gear of a wagon, built thick enough to stop a rifle ball and tall enough for men to walk behind it unseen. It was meant to be pushed forward a few feet at a time until it stood close enough to the barricade to deliver the one thing gunfire could not: a load of dynamite laid directly against the wall the barons were hiding behind. They built it themselves with whatever timber and hardware the country around Buffalo could supply, because the United States Army was still some 13 miles away at Fort McKinney, and Johnson County had decided it would not simply wait for justice to arrive on someone else's schedule. From inside the ranch house, the view was the one this film opened on. Log walls, dead horses in the yard, and beyond them a citizen army 300 or 400 strong, tightening by the day, with a rolling machine of logs and dynamite creeping closer a few feet at a time. The men who had drawn up a list of 70 names to be crossed off now had a countdown of their own, measured in however much ground the go-devil still needed before it reached the wall. For 2 nights, and into a 3rd day, the men who had ridden north to be the hunters lay listening to their own executioners being built by hand outside. 9 days earlier, they had sat in Cheyenne, deciding, name by name, who on Frank Canton's list would live and who would not. Now the deciding had passed to other hands entirely, and the men doing it had never asked to be on anyone's list at all. By the afternoon of the 13th, the go-devil was close enough that the men behind the barricade could hear the wagon wheels turning over the ground between them and it. Every foot it gained brought the invaders closer to the end they had planned for 70 other men, at a distance now measured in yards rather than miles. What had begun as a manhunt with the barons holding every advantage, a private train, a list, dynamite of their own, had become a siege in which the only dynamite left on the field belonged to Johnson County, and the only names still being crossed off anyone's list were theirs. It never reached the wall, not because the men pushing it lost their nerve, and not because the barons found a way to break the siege on their own. While Johnson County's citizens spent the 13th of April rolling their machine closer to the men they meant to kill, a telegram had already left Wyoming for Washington, carrying a request that would settle the outcome of the siege before a single stick of dynamite went off against those log walls. The men trapped inside the TA ranch did not know it yet. Neither did the men pushing the go-devil toward them, log by log, wheel turn by wheel turn, certain the next few feet of ground would decide everything. Both sides were still fighting a siege that had, without either one of them realizing it, already been decided somewhere else. Chapter 12. The Army That Saved the Killers. The telegram that had already decided the siege had not come from Washington. It had gone to Washington first, out of a governor's office in Cheyenne that had spent 9 days performing ignorance of a plan its own occupant helped make possible. Acting Governor Amos Barber, who had signed the blank authority Major Wolcott carried north before the invasion train ever left the platform, now wired 2 men in the capital who owed their careers to the same cattlemen he did. United States Senator Francis E. Warren and Senator Joseph M. Carey read Barber's telegram and understood at once whose lives were being counted down inside that ranch house. They did not wait for morning. They went to the White House in the dark and woke the President of the United States. Benjamin Harrison had been in office 3 years. He had never met Nate Champion or Nick Ray, never seen Frank Canton's list of 70 names, never watched a go-devil roll a few feet closer to a barricade of dead horses. What reached him in the night was Wyoming's own senators describing prominent citizens under siege, in danger of massacre at the hands of an armed mob, and asking the federal government to save them before the mob finished what it had started. That was the whole of the account the president had time to weigh before he gave an order that would settle, by daybreak, a fight 400 men with rifles and a homemade siege engine had not been able to settle in 3 days of trying. Harrison ordered the 6th Cavalry, garrisoned some 13 miles away at Fort McKinney, to ride to the TA Ranch and take the men inside into the custody of the United States Army. Colonel J. Van Horn led the column out before the day was fully light. By the time it reached the ranch on the afternoon of April the 13th, the Go Devil had closed nearly all the ground it needed, and the posse ringing the barrens had every reason to believe the next few hours would end the matter its own way. Instead, a bugle carried across the yard that neither side had built and neither side controlled. The posse that had spent 3 days constructing its own justice, log by bolted log, was ordered to stand down in front of the flag it had been raising money and rifles to defend since the moment Sheriff Angus called it together. The army it had waited on for reinforcement had arrived to disarm it instead. What happened next inside the TA Ranch was not an arrest, and the distinction was the entire point. Roughly 45 men, the cattlemen who had chartered the train and the gunmen they had hired to ride it, were marched out from behind their dead horses and placed under the protection of the United States Army. Protection, not prosecution. No handcuffs were produced for men who had carried a written list of 70 names to be crossed off. No shackles for the men who had burned Nate Champion out of a cabin and pinned a note to his body. The soldiers who took them into custody that afternoon were there to keep them safe from the very citizens whose sheriff, whose neighbors, and whose murdered friends had spent 3 days trying to reach them. It is worth sitting with what had actually happened, because the record does not dress it up. A private army had ridden into Johnson County to execute a list of names with no warrant, no judge, and no trial, and had very nearly been destroyed for it by the ordinary people of the county it invaded. The instrument that saved it from that reckoning was not a jury, and it was not mercy. It was a telegram from a governor who had blessed the invasion, relayed by 2 senators who answered to the same cattle money the invaders did, acted on by a president who had been told only half the story and had no reason yet to ask for the rest. The government of the United States had ridden to Wyoming at the personal order of its president to rescue the men who had planned the killing. The men who had nearly been killed by those same invaders got no such rescue from anyone. Barber's telegram had reached Washington faster than the truth ever would. The 6th Cavalry had ridden some 13 miles to stand between the association's invaders and the men they had marked for death, and it had arrived in time. What it had not done, and what no one at the TA Ranch that afternoon could yet know, was decide anything about guilt. It had only decided who would be alive to face the question, and the 45 men riding away under federal guard were about to discover how much distance still stood between being kept safe and being judged. In a courtroom, the cattlemen would choose the location of themselves. Chapter 13. A County Bankrupted to Free Them. The courtroom the cattlemen would face was not the one Sheriff Angus had spent 3 days building a siege engine to reach. It sat nearly 300 miles south, in Cheyenne, inside the same county that housed the association's own offices and the political friends who had never stopped answering its letters. The defense had argued that no jury in Johnson County could weigh the case without prejudice, and a Wyoming court agreed to move the venue. Taken on its own, the argument was not unreasonable. Taken alongside everything that had led to it, it meant the reckoning for a raid planned in Cheyenne would now be judged in Cheyenne, by a jury pool drawn from the one county in the territory where the men on trial had the deepest roots and the most friends. While the county that had buried its own dead and rebuilt a government, the invasion had gutted, paid to prosecute them from nearly 300 miles away. What followed cost Johnson County more than the invasion itself had. Feeding, housing, and guarding witnesses through months of continuance fell to a county treasury already strained by the raid it was still trying to answer for. The defense, paid from a war chest the association never had to explain to anyone, filed motion after motion, each one lawful, each one another week the county had to keep its case alive on money it did not have. A local government that had spent years watching the association run its roundups, staff its legislature, and choose its governor was now discovering, in a ledger rather than a brand book, exactly what it cost to prosecute the men who had run it. The men best placed to describe what had actually happened at the KC Ranch never reached the witness stand to say so. The two trappers who had watched Nick Ray die in the yard and Nate Champion make his stand alone inside a burning cabin, the only eyewitnesses to the killings who were not themselves among the invaders, left the territory before the trial opened and were never produced in court. Wyoming's newspapers speculated for years about where they had gone and what had persuaded them to go. No one ever proved a bribe changed hands, and no one needed to. A prosecution missing its only independent witnesses to a killing does not require proof of a payoff to collapse. It requires only their absence, and their absence was complete. The hired men fared no better as targets for justice because there was nothing left in the territory to hold them by. The Texas gunmen posted bond and went home to Texas, past the reach of a Wyoming subpoena, and with no reason on earth to return and answer for a raid they had already been paid to forget. Major Wolcott and the cattlemen who had chartered the train stayed close by, confident enough in the venue they had won to wait the case out in Cheyenne rather than run from it. By January of 1893, the case had shrunk to whatever 9 months of erosion had left standing, a county too poor to keep funding a prosecution, a witness list missing its 2 strongest names, and a jury pool from which the court could not seat 12 men without some tie to one side or the other of a fight the whole territory had followed in its own newspapers. The prosecutor asked the court to enter a nolle prosequi, the old formal notice that the state would pursue the matter no further, and the court granted it without a trial ever reaching a verdict. Of the roughly 45 men marched out from behind the TA Ranch's dead horses under Army escort, not one was ever convicted of anything connected to the killings at the KC Ranch or the siege that followed. Every man who had ridden north on the chartered train in April went home to the life he had been living before it, and for most of them, that life resumed exactly where it had left off. It leaves a question the record itself never closes, and it seems fairer to put it to you than to answer it here. Were these men truly above the law, or only ordinary men who happened to be protected by extraordinarily well-placed friends? And what does it cost a county, in money and in whatever comes after the money runs out, to prosecute the people who already run it? Johnson County had paid once to be invaded in April, and paid again, in a currency it could less afford, to fail at holding anyone accountable for it. No verdict would ever deliver that reckoning. But the voters of Wyoming still had one ballot left to cast on the matter, and not every man who had put his name to the invasion was about to survive it. Chapter 14. A Senator Pays for Other Men's Crime. No jury had convicted them, but Wyoming's voters had been watching the whole affair unfold in the territory's newspapers for the better part of a year, and in November of 1892 they delivered the verdict the courtroom never reached. The election that fall swung hard against the party the association had built its power inside of. Democrats took offices the cattlemen's faction had held as a matter of course, and among the men who lost that night was one of the two United States senators who had sat at the center of the invasion's rescue. Francis E. Warren, the very senator who had gone to the White House and roused Benjamin Harrison from his sleep to save the men riding under the association's list, was turned out of his own seat. The irony sat plainly in the record, even if no one in Cheyenne cared to say it aloud. Warren had spent the night of April the 13th working every channel of federal power he possessed to keep 45 invaders out of the hands of the county they had come to destroy. Within the year, the same territory whose institutions the association had spent a decade building into a private government stripped him of the office from which he had done it. The machine that had written a death list, chartered a train, and then begged Washington for a cavalry escort could still not buy back an election it had lost at the ballot box. A courthouse full of the baron's own lawyers had walked every invader out the door a free man. The ballot box reached one of them anyway without a single indictment. It was not, by any measure, the reckoning the county had wanted. No barons went to prison. No fortune was seized. The men who had ridden north with dynamite and a per-kill contract returned to their ranches and resumed their lives exactly as the collapsed trial had left them, untouched. What broke instead was the association's hold on the machinery of the territory itself, the roundup districts and brand books and legislative seats it had spent 20 years accumulating as though they belonged to it by right. A political monopoly built to look permanent proved, in the end, no sturdier than the men who ran it, and 1892 was the year Wyoming's voters started dismantling it, one office at a time. Warren did not stay out of Washington for long. He would win his seat back in 1895 and go on to a career that outlasted nearly everyone else touched by the invasion. A reminder that in Wyoming a senator's exile and a killer's escape could both prove temporary in their own ways. But for one election cycle, the balance sheet read plainly enough. The men who had planned the killing paid nothing for it in court, and the man who had saved them lost his seat. Power had been embarrassed at the polls without ever being called to account, and that gap would shape everything the Johnson County War left behind. The association survived the loss of a Senate seat the way it had survived the collapse of a murder trial. Bruised but intact, its charter untouched, and its roundup districts still its own. What had changed was smaller and larger at once. The territory had shown, for one election, that the cattlemen's faction could be beaten somewhere. Whether that single defeat amounted to anything more than a warning was a question the coming years, and the association's long afterlife would answer on their own terms. Chapter 15. The Crime the Country Chose to Forget. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association did not dissolve when the courthouse in Cheyenne let its invaders walk free. It kept its charter, kept its offices, and kept doing exactly what it had done since its founding 2 decades before the invasion, speaking for the state's cattle industry as though it were the state's cattle industry. The association still exists today, one of the oldest livestock trade groups in the country, still representing ranchers across the same rangeland its leadership once crossed with a death list in a saddlebag. Still a voice landowners in Cheyenne listen to before a legislative session opens. The institution that organized the crime survived it. So, for the most part, did the men who wrote the list. The grievance underneath the invasion never fully closed either. More than a century later, the same argument that once turned an unbranded calf into a crime, over who controls the open range and whose use of it counts as theft, still resurfaces every few years in fights over public land grazing rights across Wyoming and the broader American West. Federal land managers now hold much of the ground the barons once treated as theirs by custom, And working ranchers still argue in county meetings instead of Cheyenne boardrooms over who gets to graze it and on whose terms and at what price. The names on the leases have changed. The dynamite and the hired gunmen have not returned. But the underlying question, whether government, market, or the loudest ranching interest gets to decide who belongs on the land, was never resolved on the banks of the Powder River in 1892. It was only postponed. The ground itself remembers more plainly than the country's memory does. The TA Ranch, where the siege that opened this film reached its final hours, still stands in Johnson County today, a working cattle operation that also welcomes visitors curious about the history that happened on its own acres. No comparable marker points travelers toward the Cheyenne office where the list of 70 names was drawn up, or the rail spur where 50 armed men and a case of dynamite boarded a chartered train. Only the place where the killing nearly finished gets remembered and walked over by people who know its name. What most Americans inherited instead of that fuller record was a story with its ugliest parts filed off. Hollywood found the Johnson County War twice, and both times sanded it into something gentler than what happened. Cheyenne, released in 1953, drew on the same range war template, a lone gunman defending a small rancher against a big cattle interest without naming the invasion or the men who financed it. A quarter-century later, the director Michael Cimino built Heaven's Gate around the same 1892 invasion, casting it as an epic of immigrant homesteaders besieged by hired capital. The film was a critical and financial catastrophe on a scale Hollywood still talks about, and the studio that released it did not stay independent much longer. Both films are widely credited as descendants of the Johnson County War. Neither insists on the one detail the invaders worked hardest to bury, that 70 names were written down in a Cheyenne office before a single shot was fired. None of that record was ever hidden. Historians who went back to the primary sources, the list itself, the telegrams passed between Cheyenne and Washington, the diary a dying man kept and a reporter carried out, had little trouble reconstructing what the movies left on the cutting room floor. The documents survived intact, filed in the same archives they had always been filed in. What changed was which version the country chose to keep retelling around a campfire. Anyone who grew up in Wyoming's Powder River country, or who first met this story through a Western on a screen rather than a courthouse record, has been watching a different film than the one this channel just told. Tell us in the comments which version reached you first, the range war or the conspiracy, and whether the record changes how you see the land around Buffalo now. For more of the history the myths left out, subscribe to Empire of Acres. The Johnson County War was not the only time in this channel's history that men with enough capital to hire an army walked away from the consequences of using it. It is only the clearest one, the case where the list, the payroll, and the president's own midnight order all survive in the same paper trail. This time, power that outran the law left behind an unusually complete record of its own planning. And even that record was not enough to convict a single man. The war ended. The account was never settled.